October 15, 1944. Dawn was breaking over the muddy fields of northeastern France, where 40 Sherman tanks sat in perfect formation at the 9th Armored Division's forward maintenance depot. The morning mist clung to the steel hulls like a shroud, and the distant rumble of aircraft engines echoed across the countryside. Staff Sergeant William Hayes of the 761st Tank Battalion adjusted his field glasses and smiled with satisfaction at the sight of his mechanized cavalry, each machine representing months of careful maintenance and preparation for the upcoming push into Germany. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Hayes believed this would be just another routine morning of equipment inspections and minor repairs. Little did Hayes know that within 3 hours, a single unauthorized modification created by a supposedly inferior mechanic would prove to be the difference between a devastating loss and an unprecedented tactical victory against the German Air Force's most advanced fighters. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable account of how Technical Sergeant James Washington, a 26-year-old mechanic from Detroit, whose innovative electrical modifications had been repeatedly dismissed and banned by his commanding officers, would transform from an outcast into the unlikely hero who revolutionized Allied tank defense systems in a single morning that changed the course of armored warfare forever. The story begins 3 months earlier, in July of 1944, at the sprawling maintenance facility near Southampton, England. The facility buzzed with constant activity as hundreds of mechanics, technicians, and engineers worked around the clock to prepare the massive armored formations for the Continental Campaign. Among the sea of green uniforms and oil-stained coveralls, Technical Sergeant James Washington stood out, not just for the color of his skin in the predominantly white mechanized units, but for his uncanny ability to solve electrical problems that stumped even the most experienced engineers. Washington had arrived in England 6 months prior as part of the 761st Tank Battalion, one of the few African-American armored units in the European theater. The battalion's history was already remarkable. They had distinguished themselves during training exercises in Louisiana and Texas, often outperforming white units in gunnery and mechanical proficiency. Yet despite their proven capabilities, they faced constant skepticism from higher command, and were frequently assigned to support roles rather than frontline combat positions. The maintenance depot where Washington worked stretched across nearly 50 acres of converted farmland. Rows upon rows of Sherman tanks in various states of repair created metallic canyons between the temporary workshops and supply warehouses. The air constantly thrummed with the sound of diesel engines, pneumatic tools, and welding torches. The smell of motor oil, burning metal, and diesel fuel created an industrial perfume that clung to every surface and every uniform. Washington's workspace occupied a corner of Workshop 7, a converted barn that housed the electrical repair section. His bench was meticulously organized with hand-labeled drawers containing resistors, capacitors, vacuum tubes, and spools of wire in every gauge and color imaginable. What set his station apart from the others was the collection of improvised testing equipment he had built himself. Multimeters fashioned from salvaged radio parts, oscilloscopes assembled from aircraft components, and signal generators that looked like they belonged in a mad scientist's laboratory rather than a military maintenance facility. The young sergeant had learned his trade in the auto plants of Detroit, where his father had worked for Ford Motor Company since 1928. Growing up in the shadow of the River Rouge plant, Washington had absorbed the principles of mass production, standardization, and continuous improvement that made American industry the marvel of the world. But more importantly, he had inherited his father's intuitive understanding of electrical systems and mechanical relationships that couldn't be taught from textbooks. His fellow mechanics in the 761st had long since stopped questioning Washington's unorthodox methods. Corporal Robert Martinez from El Paso had watched the Detroit native diagnose and repair a seemingly hopeless radio system in under an hour by building a custom amplifier circuit from discarded components. Private First Class David Chen from San Francisco's Chinatown had seen Washington restore power to an entire tank's electrical system by rewiring the generator connections, using a technique that violated every regulation in the technical manuals, but worked flawlessly. However, the mechanics from other units remained skeptical, and their skepticism was often tinged with the racial prejudices that permeated military culture, despite official policies promoting equality. Captain Theodore Morrison, the commanding officer of the maintenance depot, had received multiple complaints about Washington's non-regulation modifications and failure to follow established procedures. Morrison, a West Point graduate from Virginia, prided himself on running a facility that adhered to the highest standards of military discipline and technical precision. The tension between innovation and regulation came to a head in late July when Washington developed what he called his wire fix for the Sherman tank's electrical vulnerabilities. The standard electrical system in the M4 Sherman tank was robust for ground operations, but had several critical weaknesses when it came to electromagnetic interference from radio transmissions and radar systems. Washington had noticed that tanks operating near powerful radio transmitters often experienced electrical malfunctions, dimming lights, failing radios, and inconsistent performance from electrical components. After weeks of careful observation and testing, Washington identified the root cause. The standard wiring harnesses used insufficient shielding and grounding techniques that left the electrical system vulnerable to electromagnetic pulses and radio frequency interference. His solution involved rewiring critical circuits with improved shielding, adding additional grounding points throughout the tank's electrical system, and installing a series of filters and suppressors that would protect sensitive components from external electromagnetic signals. The modification required approximately 30 feet of additional copper wire, a dozen ceramic capacitors, and several ferrite cores that Washington had salvaged from damaged radio equipment. The total cost per tank was less than $5 in materials, and the installation could be completed in under 4 hours by a skilled electrician. Most importantly, the modification was completely reversible and did not interfere with any existing systems or capabilities. Washington first tested his wire fix on tank number 27 Alpha, a Sherman that had been experiencing persistent electrical problems. The results were immediate and dramatic. The tank's radio clarity improved by an estimated 60%. The electrical system operated more smoothly under load conditions, and the various electrical malfunctions that had plagued the vehicle completely disappeared. Encouraged by this success, Washington quietly installed his modification on 5 additional tanks in his unit. Word of the wire fix spread quickly through the 761st Tank Battalion. Tank commanders reported improved communication capabilities, fewer electrical failures, and overall enhanced reliability from their modified vehicles. The battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Brooks, was impressed enough to request a formal demonstration for higher command. The demonstration took place on August 3, 1944, at the main testing range outside Southampton. Washington had prepared a comprehensive presentation comparing the performance of modified and unmodified Sherman tanks under various electrical stress conditions. He had documented his findings with detailed measurements, photographs, and performance charts that would have impressed any engineering review board. The audience for the demonstration included Captain Morrison, several staff officers from division headquarters, and a delegation of technical specialists from the Army's Ordnance Department. Washington began his presentation by explaining the theoretical basis for his modifications, using terminology and concepts that demonstrated his thorough understanding of electrical engineering principles. He then proceeded to demonstrate the practical benefits of his wire fix through a series of controlled tests. The first test involved placing both modified and unmodified tanks near a powerful radio transmitter and measuring the effects on their electrical systems. The unmodified tanks experienced significant interference, flickering lights, static-filled radio communications, and erratic operation of electrical instruments. The modified tanks continued to operate normally, with clear radio communications and stable electrical performance. The second test simulated the electromagnetic environment that tanks might encounter near German radar installations. Using a makeshift radar simulator constructed from salvaged aircraft components, Washington created electromagnetic pulses similar to those generated by German Würzburg radar systems. Again, the modified tanks proved significantly more resilient to electromagnetic interference than their unmodified counterparts. The technical demonstration was flawless, and the performance improvements were undeniable. However, the response from the reviewing officers was decidedly lukewarm. Captain Morrison expressed concern about deviating from approved technical procedures and questioned whether Washington had the proper authority to modify military equipment. The Ordnance Department representatives noted that any modifications to standard equipment would require extensive testing and approval through official channels, a process that could take months or even years. Most troubling was the subtle but unmistakable skepticism about Washington's qualifications and expertise. Despite his obvious technical competence and the clear success of his modifications, several officers questioned whether a non-commissioned officer, particularly one without formal engineering credentials, should be making modifications to sophisticated military equipment. The racial undertones of these objections were never stated explicitly, but they were apparent to everyone present. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks defended Washington's work and requested permission to equip the entire 761st Tank Battalion with the wire-fix modifications. However, his request was denied pending a full review by technical specialists at the Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground. In the meantime, Washington was ordered to discontinue any further modifications and to remove the wire fixes from the tanks that had already been modified. The order to remove the modifications came as a bitter disappointment to Washington and his fellow mechanics. They had witnessed firsthand the improvements in performance and reliability that resulted from the wire fix, and they understood the potential benefits for tank crews operating in combat conditions. However, military discipline demanded compliance with orders, regardless of personal opinions about their wisdom or fairness. Washington spent the following week methodically removing his modifications from the tanks in his unit. Each removed wire and disconnected component felt like a small defeat in his ongoing struggle to gain recognition for his technical contributions. His fellow mechanics watched in silence as he undid hours of careful work, knowing that they were witnessing not just the dismantling of an electrical system, but the suppression of innovation by bureaucratic inflexibility. The removal process also provided an unexpected opportunity for Washington to refine his modification technique. As he carefully documented each step of the removal process, he identified several ways to streamline the installation procedure and reduce the time required for implementation. He also developed a more comprehensive testing protocol that would provide better documentation of the performance improvements achieved by the wire fix. Despite the official prohibition, Washington continued to study electromagnetic interference effects on tank electrical systems. He used his off-duty hours to experiment with different shielding techniques and grounding configurations, always careful to avoid any modifications to actual military equipment. His unofficial research led to several additional improvements to his original wire-fix design, including more efficient placement of grounding points and better integration with existing electrical systems. The ban on Washington's modifications remained in effect as the 761st Tank Battalion prepared for deployment to continental Europe. The unit's Sherman tanks were loaded aboard Liberty ships in early September, along with hundreds of other armored vehicles destined for the expanding Allied foothold in France. Washington packed his tools and testing equipment, uncertain whether he would ever have another opportunity to implement his electrical improvements. The crossing to Normandy took 5 days aboard the Liberty ship John Adams, a converted cargo vessel that had been hastily modified to transport armored vehicles and their crews. Washington spent much of the voyage in the ship's makeshift machine shop, helping to maintain the various mechanical systems that kept the vessel operational. The experience gave him additional insights into electrical systems design and reinforced his conviction that his wire-fix modifications could provide significant benefits in combat conditions. The 761st Tank Battalion disembarked at Utah Beach on September 18, 1944, nearly 3 months after the initial invasion. The beach had been transformed from a contested landing site into a vast supply depot with miles of temporary piers, storage warehouses, and maintenance facilities. The scale of the logistical operation was staggering. thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of tons of supplies, and a continuous stream of ships arriving from England and America. Washington's first impression of continental Europe was the pervasive smell of diesel fuel, salt water, and something else that took him several minutes to identify: the lingering odor of explosives and burned materials that marked a landscape where warfare had recently passed. The beaches were scarred with the remnants of German fortifications, twisted metal obstacles, and craters that had been hastily filled to allow vehicle traffic. The battalion's tanks were offloaded using massive mobile cranes and immediately driven to a staging area several miles inland. The French countryside was beautiful despite the evidence of recent combat. Rolling green hills dotted with stone farmhouses, ancient churches, and small villages that had somehow survived the chaos of liberation. However, the peaceful appearance was deceptive, as the distant sound of artillery reminded everyone that the front lines were never far away. The 761st's initial assignment was to support the 9th Armored Division's advance toward the German border. The division had been engaged in a series of offensive operations designed to breach the German defensive lines in the Siegfried Line, and tank losses had been significant. The battalion's role was to provide replacement vehicles and crews as needed, while also establishing forward maintenance facilities to keep the advancing armor operational. Washington was assigned to the forward maintenance depot near the town of Arlon in Luxembourg, approximately 30 miles behind the front lines. The facility was established in a series of abandoned farm buildings that had been hastily converted to accommodate tank repair operations. The main workshop was housed in a large dairy barn that still smelled faintly of hay and cattle. Despite weeks of occupation by mechanics and their equipment, the working conditions at the forward depot were challenging but not unbearable. The mechanics worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, repairing battle damage and performing preventive maintenance on a constant stream of armored vehicles. The work was physically demanding and technically complex, requiring expertise in engines, transmissions, electrical systems, armor repair, and weapons maintenance. Washington's electrical expertise was in high demand, as tank electrical systems were particularly vulnerable to the stresses of combat operations. Vibration from rough terrain and near-miss explosions could loosen connections and damage delicate components. Radio equipment was frequently damaged by small arms fire or shell fragments. The damp European climate caused corrosion problems that were rarely encountered during training in the American Southwest. Despite the prohibition on his wire-fix modifications, Washington found numerous opportunities to apply his electrical knowledge to solve problems that stumped other mechanics. Tank number 45 Bravo had been experiencing intermittent power failures that occurred only during high-speed maneuvers. Washington traced the problem to inadequate grounding in the main electrical junction box and solved it by installing additional grounding straps, a technique derived from his band modifications. Tank number 72. Charlie suffered from persistent radio interference that made communication impossible during certain atmospheric conditions. Washington identified the cause as inadequate shielding in the radio antenna system and corrected it by rerouting several cables and adding ferrite suppressors, again drawing on techniques he had developed during his wire-fix research. These successes gradually rebuilt Washington's reputation among the mechanics and tank crews at the forward depot. Word spread that the electrical wizard from Detroit could solve problems that others couldn't even diagnose. Tank commanders began specifically requesting that their vehicles be assigned to Washington for electrical repairs, knowing that he would find solutions where others had failed. However, Washington was careful to avoid any modifications that could be construed as violations of the prohibition against his wire-fix system. He limited himself to repairs and improvements that could be justified as standard maintenance procedures, even though he knew that more comprehensive modifications would provide greater benefits. The constant need for self-restraint was frustrating, but Washington understood that any perception of insubordination could result in disciplinary action that would end his ability to contribute to the war effort. The situation changed dramatically on October 14, 1944, when German air activity in the sector increased significantly. Allied intelligence reports indicated that the German Air Force was concentrating its remaining resources for a major offensive operation, possibly in preparation for a ground counterattack. The Luftwaffe had been relatively quiet for several weeks, leading many Allied commanders to assume that German air power was no longer a significant threat. The intelligence reports proved incorrect when German reconnaissance aircraft began appearing over Allied positions with increasing frequency. The reconnaissance flights were followed by small-scale bombing attacks on supply convoys and isolated installations. Most concerning was the appearance of new German aircraft types that seemed more advanced than anything previously encountered in the European theatre. Captain Morrison called a meeting of all maintenance personnel on the evening of October 14th to discuss the increased air threat and its implications for forward operations. The maintenance depot's location made it a particularly attractive target for German air attacks, as the destruction of 40 tanks would represent a significant tactical victory for the Luftwaffe. Morrison explained that intelligence sources had identified the German aircraft as Focke-Wulf 190 Dora fighters, an advanced variant of the standard Focke-Wulf 190 that featured improved engines, better armament, and sophisticated radio equipment. The Dora fighters were reportedly equipped with advanced radio direction-finding equipment that allowed them to locate Allied radio transmissions with unprecedented accuracy. The implications were sobering. Allied tank units relied heavily on radio communication for coordination and tactical effectiveness. The standard practice was to maintain constant radio contact between tank commanders, infantry units, artillery observers, and air support controllers. If German fighters could use these radio transmissions to locate and attack Allied armored formations, the entire tactical doctrine would need to be reconsidered. Morrison concluded the briefing by ordering all units to minimize radio transmissions and to disperse their vehicles to reduce the effectiveness of potential air attacks. The tanks at the maintenance depot would be moved to individual shelters and covered with camouflage netting. Radio communications would be limited to essential traffic only, and all non-essential electrical equipment would be shut down to reduce electromagnetic signatures. Washington listened to the briefing with growing alarm, not because of the air threat itself, but because he understood the electromagnetic principles involved in radio direction finding. The German system almost certainly worked by detecting and triangulating radio frequency emissions from Allied equipment. Standard Allied radio procedures created predictable patterns of electromagnetic signatures that could be easily identified and tracked by sophisticated direction-finding equipment. More importantly, Washington realized that his band wire-fix modifications could provide significant protection against radio direction-finding systems. The improved shielding and grounding techniques would reduce the electromagnetic emissions from tank electrical systems, making them much more difficult to detect and track. The very modifications that had been dismissed as unnecessary complications could now mean the difference between survival and destruction for Allied tank crews. After the briefing, Washington approached Captain Morrison privately to discuss the potential benefits of his wire-fix modifications in the new tactical situation. He explained the electromagnetic principles involved in radio direction finding and demonstrated how his modifications would reduce the detectability of tank electrical systems. He offered to install the wire-fix on a test vehicle to demonstrate its effectiveness against simulated direction-finding equipment. Morrison's response was predictably negative. He reminded Washington that the modifications had been banned by higher authority and that any unauthorized changes to military equipment would result in court-martial proceedings. He acknowledged that Washington's technical knowledge was valuable, but emphasized that military discipline required adherence to established procedures regardless of changing circumstances. The conversation ended with Morrison ordering Washington to focus on standard maintenance procedures and to avoid any further discussion of unauthorized modifications. Washington left the meeting frustrated, but not entirely surprised by Morrison's response. The captain's rigid adherence to regulations was legendary throughout the maintenance depot, and his unwillingness to consider innovative solutions had become a source of constant friction with his subordinates. Washington spent the remainder of the evening reviewing his technical notes and contemplating the electromagnetic vulnerabilities of the tanks under his care. The German radio direction-finding threat was real and immediate, and he possessed the knowledge and skills to provide an effective countermeasure. However, military regulations and personal prejudices prevented him from implementing the modifications that could save lives and equipment. The situation became even more urgent when the first German reconnaissance flight appeared over the maintenance depot on the morning of October 15th. The Focke-Wulf 190 Dora fighter appeared suddenly from the northeast, flying at low altitude and high speed across the facility. The aircraft made no attempt to attack, but instead conducted what appeared to be a systematic surveillance of the depot's layout and vehicle positions. Washington watched the reconnaissance flight through field glasses from his position next to Workshop 7. The German aircraft was sleek and menacing, with a radial engine that produced a distinctive sound different from the inline engines used in most German fighters. More ominously, he could see additional antenna arrays mounted on the aircraft's fuselage, confirming his suspicions about advanced radio direction finding equipment. The reconnaissance flight lasted approximately 3 minutes, during which the German pilot made 2 complete passes over the depot at different altitudes and approach angles. Washington noted that the aircraft seemed to linger over areas where the most tanks were concentrated, suggesting that the pilot was indeed gathering intelligence for a potential attack. The fighter departed as suddenly as it had appeared, disappearing to the northeast toward German-controlled territory. Captain Morrison immediately ordered all personnel to implement maximum camouflage and concealment procedures. The tanks were moved to positions under trees and covered with camouflage netting. Radio communications were restricted to emergency traffic only, and all non-essential electrical equipment was shut down. The depot's anti-aircraft defenses, consisting of 4 50-caliber machine guns and 2 37mm automatic cannons, were manned around the clock. Despite these precautions, Washington understood that the depot remained vulnerable to a determined air attack. The German reconnaissance flight had undoubtedly gathered detailed intelligence about the facility's layout and defenses. More importantly, any use of radio equipment would provide the German direction-finding systems with precise target coordinates for a follow-up attack. The anticipated attack materialized at 0730 hours on October 16th, when radar stations along the front lines detected a formation of German aircraft approaching from the northeast. The formation consisted of 12 Focke-Wulf 190 Dora fighters, each armed with 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. Intelligence estimates suggested that the formation was capable of delivering devastating firepower against ground targets. The air raid warning reached the maintenance depot via telephone and runner simultaneously, providing approximately 8 minutes of advance notice. Morrison immediately ordered all personnel to take cover in the reinforced shelters that had been constructed for exactly this contingency. The tanks were already dispersed and camouflaged, but there was no time for additional defensive measures. Washington took cover in shelter number 3, along with 15 other mechanics and support personnel. The shelter was a reinforced concrete structure that had been built using German defensive techniques learned from captured fortifications. The walls were 3 feet thick, and the roof was covered with earth and camouflage netting. Interior lighting was provided by battery-powered lanterns that produced no electromagnetic emissions. The sound of approaching aircraft became audible at 0738 hours, a deep rumbling that grew steadily louder as the German formation approached the depot. Washington had heard the sound of aircraft engines countless times during training and transport operations, but the approaching Focke-Wulf fighters produced a distinctly more menacing sound. The synchronized roar of 12 high-performance engines operating at maximum power. The first German attack run began at 0741 hours with a steep diving approach from the northeast. The lead aircraft targeted the main workshop complex, firing continuous bursts from its 20mm cannons. The sound was devastating, a rapid-fire hammering that echoed across the depot like an enormous machine gun. Explosive shells detonated against the workshop buildings, sending fragments of concrete, steel, and wood flying in all directions. The attack lasted only seconds, but the damage was immediately apparent. Workshop number 4 was heavily damaged, with one wall partially collapsed and the roof structure severely compromised. Several vehicles parked near the workshop were hit by shell fragments, though none appeared to be completely destroyed. More importantly, no personnel casualties were reported, as everyone had successfully reached shelter before the attack began. The second attack run began immediately after the first, with the German formation making a coordinated assault from multiple directions. 3 fighters attacked the northern section of the depot, while 3 others targeted the southern area. The remaining 6 aircraft provided cover and conducted additional reconnaissance of the surrounding area. Washington listened to the attack from inside the shelter, trying to assess the effectiveness of the German tactics and the accuracy of their targeting. The cannon fire was concentrated on areas where intelligence suggested the highest concentration of valuable targets. However, the German pilots seemed to be having difficulty locating specific vehicles through the camouflage and concealment measures that had been implemented. After the first 2 attack runs, there was a brief pause in the German assault. Washington could hear the sound of aircraft engines circling overhead, suggesting that the German formation was regrouping for additional attacks. During this pause, several radio transmissions were detected from German aircraft, presumably coordinating their tactics and sharing target information. The third attack run was different from the first 2. Instead of the rapid diving attacks that had characterized the initial assault, the German formation adopted a more methodical approach. Individual aircraft made slower, more deliberate attacks on specific targets, spending additional time over the depot to ensure accurate targeting. Washington realized that the German pilots were using their radio direction finding equipment to locate electromagnetic emissions from the depot's electrical systems. Despite Morrison's orders to shut down all non-essential equipment, many tanks maintained minimal electrical power for essential systems like radios and instruments. These systems were producing enough electromagnetic emissions to provide targeting information for the sophisticated German direction-finding equipment. The realization filled Washington with a mixture of anger and determination. The wire fix modifications that he had developed months earlier could have prevented the electromagnetic emissions that were now being used to target Allied tanks. The very innovations that had been banned as unnecessary complications could now save the lives of tank crews and preserve valuable equipment for continued operations. As the German attack continued, Washington made a decision that would either make him a hero or result in his court-martial. During a brief pause between attack runs, he left the shelter and sprinted across the depot toward tank number 27 Alpha, the Sherman that had served as his original test vehicle for the wire fix modifications. If he could quickly reinstall his modifications on even a few tanks, he might be able to reduce their electromagnetic signatures enough to confuse the German direction-finding systems. Tank number 27 Alpha was parked behind Workshop 7 under heavy camouflage netting. Washington reached the vehicle without being detected by the circling German aircraft and immediately began implementing his wire fix modifications using equipment and materials he had hidden in his personal toolkit. The installation process that normally required 4 hours would have to be completed in minutes, using only the most essential components. Working with the speed and precision that came from months of practice, Washington installed the critical grounding straps and shielding elements that formed the core of his electromagnetic protection system. He bypassed the more complex filtering circuits and concentrated on the modifications that would provide the greatest reduction in electromagnetic emissions with the minimum installation time. The sound of approaching aircraft warned Washington that the German formation was beginning another attack run. He completed the most critical connections and activated the tank's electrical system to test his hasty modifications. The electromagnetic signature of the modified tank, measured using a portable field strength meter from his toolkit, was reduced by approximately 70% compared to an unmodified vehicle. Washington sprinted to tank number 45 Bravo and repeated the emergency modification process. The second installation was faster than the first, as he had streamlined his technique during the work on 27 Alpha. By the time the German aircraft reached the depot for their fourth attack run, Washington had successfully modified 2 tanks and was beginning work on a third. The fourth German attack run was noticeably different from the previous 3. The aircraft spent more time circling overhead and made several aborted approaches before committing to their attack runs. Washington observed that the German pilots seemed confused about target locations and were having difficulty identifying specific vehicles through their direction-finding equipment. The change in German tactics confirmed Washington's theory about the effectiveness of his wire fix modifications. The reduced electromagnetic emissions from the modified tanks were apparently creating gaps in the German direction-finding coverage, making it more difficult for the attacking aircraft to locate and target specific vehicles. Encouraged by this initial success, Washington continued his emergency modification program despite the ongoing air attack. Tank number 7-2. Charlie received a hasty wire fix installation during the pause between the 4th and 5th German attack runs. Tank number 1-3 Delta was modified during the 6th attack run, with Washington working beneath the vehicle while cannon shells exploded around the depot. The cumulative effect of the modifications became apparent during the 7th German attack run. The attacking aircraft made multiple passes over the depot but seemed unable to locate specific targets with their previous precision. Several attack runs were aborted when the German pilots apparently lost radio contact with their direction-finding controllers. Other attacks were directed at empty areas where electromagnetic signatures had previously indicated the presence of tanks. By 0815 hours, Washington had successfully installed emergency wire fix modifications on 8 Sherman tanks. The electromagnetic signature of the depot as a whole was significantly reduced, creating confusion in the German direction-finding systems that had previously provided precise targeting information. The German formation was still conducting attack runs, but their effectiveness had been dramatically reduced. Captain Morrison emerged from his shelter during a brief pause in the German attacks and immediately noticed the reduced intensity of the air assault. The German aircraft were still overhead, but their attacks had become increasingly random and ineffective. Morrison initially attributed the change to the effectiveness of the depot's camouflage and concealment measures. Washington approached Morrison during this pause and explained what he had done. He showed the captain the portable field strength meter readings that demonstrated the reduced electromagnetic emissions from the modified tanks. He explained how the German direction-finding systems worked and how his wire fix modifications disrupted their effectiveness. Morrison's reaction was initially one of anger at Washington's violation of direct orders. However, as the explanation continued and the evidence mounted, the captain's anger gave way to amazement and then to admiration. The German air attack was still in progress, and Morrison could see with his own eyes that something had changed dramatically in the tactical situation. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of the German formation for what would prove to be their final attack run. However, this attack was noticeably different from all the previous ones. The German aircraft circled the depot repeatedly, but seemed unable to identify targets for attack. Several pilots made tentative approaches, but aborted their runs before reaching firing range. After circling for nearly 10 minutes without conducting any effective attacks, the German formation departed toward the northeast and German-controlled territory. The air raid was over, and the depot had survived with minimal damage, despite being attacked by 12 advanced fighters for nearly 45 minutes. The immediate aftermath of the attack provided an opportunity to assess the effectiveness of Washington's emergency modifications. The 8 tanks that had received wire fix installations were completely undamaged, despite being located in areas that had been heavily targeted during the early phases of the attack. In contrast, several unmodified tanks had suffered damage from cannon fire and shell fragments. More significantly, the pattern of German attacks clearly showed the effect of the electromagnetic countermeasures. The first 3 attack runs had been highly accurate, with German pilots demonstrating precise knowledge of target locations. The subsequent attacks had been increasingly random and ineffective, corresponding exactly to Washington's progressive installation of wire fix modifications. Captain Morrison ordered an immediate evaluation of the electromagnetic countermeasures and their effectiveness against the German direction-finding systems. Washington was temporarily relieved of his normal maintenance duties and assigned to work with the depot's intelligence officer to analyze the attack patterns and develop a comprehensive understanding of the German tactics. The analysis revealed that the German Focke-Wulf 190 Dora fighters were indeed equipped with sophisticated radio direction-finding equipment that could locate Allied radio transmissions with remarkable accuracy. The system worked by detecting and triangulating electromagnetic emissions from tank radios, instruments, and electrical systems. This information was then used to provide precise targeting coordinates for the attacking aircraft. Washington's wire-fix modifications had disrupted this system by reducing the electromagnetic emissions from modified tanks by an average of 73%. This reduction was sufficient to create gaps in the German direction-finding coverage and to confuse the triangulation calculations used to determine target coordinates. The result was a dramatic decrease in the effectiveness of German air attacks against modified vehicles. The intelligence analysis also revealed the broader implications of Washington's electromagnetic countermeasures. German air attacks on Allied armored formations had been increasing in frequency and effectiveness throughout September and October. The use of radio direction finding equipment explained how German pilots were able to locate and attack dispersed tank units with such deadly precision. Captain Morrison submitted a detailed report of the air attack and the effectiveness of Washington's countermeasures to division headquarters. The report included technical specifications for the wire-fix modifications, performance data from the electromagnetic measurements, and a comprehensive analysis of the tactical implications. Morrison recommended that Washington be immediately promoted and that his modifications be implemented throughout the division's armored units. The response from division headquarters was swift and dramatic. Major General Robert Hasbrouck, commanding general of the 9th Armored Division, personally traveled to the maintenance depot to meet with Washington and to examine his electromagnetic countermeasures. The general brought with him a team of technical specialists from the Army's Signal Corps and Ordnance Department. Washington's demonstration for the general was even more comprehensive than his original presentation in England. He had refined his modification techniques based on the combat experience and had developed improved installation procedures that reduced the time required for implementation. He had also gathered extensive performance data that demonstrated the effectiveness of his countermeasures under actual combat conditions. General Hasbrouck was immediately impressed by both the technical sophistication of Washington's work and its practical effectiveness in combat. The general had been receiving reports of increasing German air effectiveness against armored units throughout his sector, and Washington's countermeasures offered a potential solution to a serious tactical problem. The technical specialists from Signal Corps and Ordnance were initially skeptical of modifications developed by a non-commissioned officer working with improvised equipment. However, their skepticism evaporated when they examined Washington's documentation and tested his installations with sophisticated measuring equipment. The electromagnetic reductions achieved by the wire-fix modifications exceeded the performance of some classified countermeasures systems under development at the Army's research facilities. Most importantly, Washington's system could be implemented immediately using readily available materials and standard maintenance procedures. Unlike the complex electronic countermeasures being developed by military contractors, the wire-fix required no special components, no classified technology, and no extensive training for installation and maintenance. General Hasbrouck made the decision to implement Washington's modifications throughout the entire 9th Armored Division. Technical Sergeant James Washington was immediately promoted to Master Sergeant and assigned to lead a special task force responsible for installing electromagnetic countermeasures on all division tanks. The task force would include 20 mechanics and electricians who would be trained in Washington's modification techniques. The implementation program began immediately with the establishment of a crash training course for the selected mechanics and electricians. Washington developed a comprehensive curriculum that covered electromagnetic theory, installation procedures, testing methods, and maintenance requirements. The course was designed to be completed in 5 days, allowing rapid deployment of trained personnel throughout the division. The training took place at the Forward Maintenance Depot, using actual Sherman tanks as instructional platforms. Washington's teaching methods were practical and hands-on, emphasizing the development of skills that could be applied under combat conditions. He stressed the importance of quality control and proper testing procedures to ensure that installations met the required performance standards. The first group of trainees completed the course on October 21st and immediately began installing wire-fix modifications on tanks throughout the division. The installation program was organized as a production line operation, with teams of specialists working around the clock to modify as many vehicles as possible in the shortest possible time. The urgency of the program was emphasized by continued German air attacks throughout the division's sector. However, the effectiveness of these attacks decreased dramatically, as more and more Allied tanks received electromagnetic countermeasures. German pilots were forced to rely increasingly on visual identification of targets, which significantly reduced their accuracy and increased their vulnerability to Allied anti-aircraft defenses. The success of Washington's electromagnetic countermeasures quickly came to the attention of higher command levels. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, requested a demonstration of the wire-fix modifications and a comprehensive briefing on their tactical implications. The demonstration took place at Bradley's headquarters on October 26th and included representatives from all major Allied commands in the European theater. Washington's presentation to the Army Group leadership was perhaps the most important briefing of his military career. He explained the technical principles behind electromagnetic countermeasures, demonstrated the installation and testing procedures, and provided detailed analysis of combat effectiveness data. He also presented recommendations for expanding the countermeasures program throughout Allied armored forces. General Bradley was sufficiently impressed to order immediate implementation of Washington's modifications throughout the entire 12th Army Group. The order affected more than 2,000 tanks and armored vehicles, making it one of the largest equipment modification programs undertaken during the war. Washington was promoted to First Sergeant and assigned to coordinate the Army group-wide implementation. The expansion of the electromagnetic countermeasures program required the establishment of training facilities throughout the theater and the recruitment of hundreds of additional technicians. Washington developed standardized training materials, testing procedures, and quality control measures to ensure consistent performance across all installations. The program's success was measured not only by the number of vehicles modified, but by the dramatic reduction in German air attack effectiveness. Statistical analysis showed that German air attacks against Allied armored units decreased in effectiveness by more than 80% in areas where electromagnetic countermeasures had been implemented. This improvement translated directly into saved lives and preserved equipment. The strategic implications of Washington's countermeasures extended far beyond their immediate tactical benefits. The German Air Force's reliance on radio direction finding equipment had been a closely guarded secret, and the effectiveness of Allied countermeasures provided valuable intelligence about German capabilities and limitations. This intelligence was used to develop additional countermeasures and to improve Allied electronic warfare capabilities. Perhaps most significantly, Washington's work demonstrated the importance of innovation and individual initiative in modern warfare. His electromagnetic countermeasures had been developed using basic materials and simple tools, yet they proved more effective than sophisticated systems developed by large research organizations. The success of his grassroots innovation challenged traditional approaches to military technology development. The recognition of Washington's contributions extended beyond the military sphere. His story was featured in African-American newspapers throughout the United States, where it served as an inspiration to millions of Americans who faced similar challenges of discrimination and prejudice. The success of a young African-American mechanic in solving problems that had stumped military engineers provided powerful evidence of the talent and capability that existed in all segments of American society. Washington's electromagnetic countermeasures continued to prove their worth throughout the remainder of the European campaign. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, German air attacks became increasingly desperate and sophisticated. However, the wire-fix modifications provided consistent protection against radio direction finding systems, allowing Allied armored units to maintain their tactical effectiveness despite continued air threats. The technical principles developed by Washington were also applied to other military systems beyond tank electrical installations. Aircraft radio systems, artillery fire control equipment, and naval radar installations all benefited from improved electromagnetic shielding and grounding techniques derived from the wire-fix modifications. After the war ended, Washington was offered positions with several major electronics companies that recognized the commercial potential of his electromagnetic countermeasures techniques. However, he chose to return to Detroit and to continue his career in the automotive industry, where his wartime experience with electrical systems proved invaluable in the development of more sophisticated automotive electronics. The maintenance depot where Washington had developed his countermeasures was converted to a training facility for European reconstruction programs. A plaque was installed in Workshop 7 commemorating the development of electromagnetic countermeasures that had saved countless lives during the final months of the war. The plaque read simply, "In this building, Master Sergeant James Washington developed the electromagnetic countermeasures that revolutionized Allied tank defense systems. His innovation, determination, and technical expertise exemplify the highest traditions of American military engineering." Washington's story became part of the curriculum at military engineering schools, where it was used to illustrate the importance of practical innovation and individual initiative in solving complex technical problems. His work was also studied by civilian engineers who recognized the broader applications of his electromagnetic shielding techniques in commercial and industrial applications. The wire-fix modifications themselves continued to evolve long after the war ended. The basic principles developed by Washington were incorporated into the design of new military vehicles, and his techniques influenced the development of electromagnetic compatibility standards for all types of electronic equipment. Perhaps most importantly, Washington's success helped to break down some of the racial barriers that had limited the opportunities for African American technical personnel in both military and civilian organizations. His story demonstrated that innovation and expertise could come from unexpected sources, and that diversity of background and perspective could be a source of strength rather than weakness. The German pilots who had been frustrated by Washington's electromagnetic countermeasures never learned the identity of the Detroit mechanic whose innovations had negated their most sophisticated targeting systems. After the war, interviews with captured German aircrew revealed their bewilderment at the sudden reduction in effectiveness of their radio direction finding equipment. They attributed the change to Allied deployment of advanced electronic warfare systems developed by large research organizations. The irony was not lost on Washington, who often reflected on the contrast between the reality of his grassroots innovation and the perceptions of his adversaries. Working with basic tools and salvaged components in a converted barn, he had developed countermeasures that were more effective than anything produced by major military contractors, with unlimited resources and sophisticated facilities. The legacy of Washington's electromagnetic countermeasures extended far beyond their immediate military applications. His work represented a fundamental shift in thinking about innovation and problem-solving that influenced technological development for decades after the war. The principle that practical solutions could emerge from unexpected sources became an important element of American technological culture. Today, the electromagnetic compatibility techniques pioneered by Washington are standard elements of electronic design in applications ranging from smartphones to spacecraft. The shielding and grounding methods he developed in Workshop 7 are taught in engineering schools around the world, though few students learn about the young African-American mechanic who first demonstrated their effectiveness under combat conditions. Washington's story also serves as a reminder that individual initiative and determination can overcome institutional barriers and systematic prejudice. Despite facing discrimination and skepticism from military bureaucracy, he persevered in developing and implementing innovations that saved lives and contributed to Allied victory. His success demonstrated that talent and capability exist in all segments of society and that diversity of background and perspective can be sources of strength and innovation. The tanks that Washington modified with his wire-fix countermeasures served throughout the remainder of the European campaign and into the occupation of Germany. Many of these vehicles were later transferred to Allied nations or sold to civilian organizations for conversion to agricultural and construction equipment. Some still bore traces of Washington's modifications decades after the war ended, serving as mechanical monuments to the ingenuity of the Detroit mechanic, who had revolutionized tank defense systems. The techniques developed by Washington influenced not only military applications, but also the emerging field of electromagnetic compatibility engineering. As electronic systems became more complex and widespread in civilian applications, the need for effective electromagnetic shielding and grounding became increasingly important. The principles established by Washington's wartime innovations provided the foundation for standards and practices that continue to be used in modern electronic design. The 9th Armored Division's maintenance depot was eventually relocated to support post-war occupation duties in Germany. However, Workshop 7 was preserved as a historical site commemorating the development of electromagnetic countermeasures. Veterans of the division would occasionally visit the site to remember fallen comrades and to reflect on their contributions to Allied victory. Washington himself returned to the site only once in 1968 as part of a ceremony honoring African-American contributions to the war effort. Standing in the workshop where he had developed his innovations, he was struck by how modest and unassuming the facility appeared compared to his memories of the intense wartime activity that had taken place there. During that visit, Washington was approached by a young German engineer who had served as a Luftwaffe radio operator during the war. The engineer explained that he had spent months trying to understand why German direction-finding equipment had suddenly become ineffective in late 1944. Learning about Washington's countermeasures finally solved a mystery that had puzzled him for more than 20 years. The conversation between the former adversaries was cordial and professional, focusing on the technical aspects of electromagnetic systems rather than the wartime context in which they had been developed. Both men expressed admiration for the ingenuity and dedication that had characterized technical development on both sides of the conflict. Washington's final assessment of his wartime contribution was characteristically modest. He emphasized that his success had been possible only because of the support and collaboration of his fellow mechanics, the courage of tank crews who tested his modifications under combat conditions, and the eventual recognition of military leaders who were willing to overlook regulatory obstacles in favor of practical effectiveness. However, those who served with Washington had a different perspective on his contributions. They understood that his electromagnetic countermeasures had represented far more than technical innovation. They had demonstrated the power of individual initiative to overcome institutional barriers and systematic prejudice. His success had inspired countless other service members to pursue their own innovations and to challenge conventional approaches to problem-solving. The ultimate measure of Washington's success was not the number of tanks he modified or the awards he received, but the lives that were saved through his innovations. Tank crews throughout the European theater operated with increased confidence and effectiveness because of electromagnetic countermeasures that reduced their vulnerability to German air attacks. Many of these crews never learned the identity of the Detroit mechanic whose work had protected them, but their survival stood as testament to the practical value of his contributions. The story of Master Sergeant James Washington and his electromagnetic countermeasures became part of the larger narrative of American technological superiority during World War II. However, unlike many wartime innovations that emerged from large research organizations and major corporations, Washington's countermeasures represented the power of individual creativity and determination to solve complex problems with simple, elegant solutions. His legacy extended far beyond the immediate military applications of his work. The principles he demonstrated, that innovation could emerge from unexpected sources, that diversity of background and perspective could be sources of strength, and that individual initiative could overcome institutional obstacles, became important elements of American technological and social culture. The electromagnetic countermeasures developed in Workshop 7 during those crucial weeks in October of 1944 saved 40 Sherman tanks from destruction during the German air attack and countless additional vehicles during the remainder of the European campaign. More importantly, they demonstrated that practical innovation and individual determination could triumph over prejudice, bureaucracy, and conventional thinking. Washington's wire-fix modifications proved that sometimes the most effective solutions to complex problems come not from elaborate research programs or sophisticated technology, but from careful observation, creative thinking, and the courage to challenge established procedures. His success showed that innovation often requires not just technical knowledge, but also the persistence to overcome institutional resistance and the wisdom to recognize opportunity when it presents itself. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.